As an avid Jordan Peterson watcher myself, I've always wondered, what are his takes on the Second Amendment? And it took me a bit to go out there and assemble a bunch of different quotes, including videos and things that he's written for different publications. And I figured if I thought this was interesting, maybe you do too. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm going to be showing you a couple different clips, and you can click on the links in the description box below to see the longer form of them. The first one's the longest. It's give take, I think, about 90 seconds. He's doing one of his old school streams with viewers and supporters and folks that just want to check him out. And someone asks him basically about firearms and guns and that kind of stuff. He's going to go a little bit into his background, growing up in northwestern Canada, a little bit into his father, and then he's going to hit you with a quote that I'm going to be focused on the end. So don't worry about paying super close attention to it because I'm going to highlight it for you. But here's the first clip.
How important do you believe the American right to bear arms and maintain militias? Is it equivalent to the right to free speech? Well, I don't think anything is equivalent to the right to free speech or the responsibility for free speech. How important do I believe that right is? Jesus, that's a tough question. You know, my dad's a hunter. He has 200 rifles, something like that. They're all single shots because he believes in aiming carefully. The culture I come from, which is northwestern Canada, is a rural culture, a hunting culture. People take their guns seriously there. And it is definitely part of their lifestyle. I mean, my dad's hunted his whole life, and we ate wild meat almost all the time I was growing up. I think that the right to bear arms is one of the markers of a free society. I don't think it's reasonable that only the police and the army should be allowed to be dangerous.
Okay, so the relevant part of that for our purposes is this, quote, I think the right to bear arms is one of the markers of a free society. I don't think it's reasonable that only the police and the army should be allowed to be dangerous, end quote. So what's going on here? Well, fundamentally, what the Second Amendment and what gun laws are all about is who has the right to violence, who has access to violence in society. In societies with tight gun laws, perhaps complete abolition, what is effectively taking place is the government has monopolized the use of force. The threat there being two things. One, once the government has monopolized that use of force, what could they do next? And there's queue up any number of examples from not only the 20th century and back, English Civil War, all that kind of stuff, but look no further than what's modern day world happening in Venezuela and other states as well, where governments ban firearms, institute mass gun control, and then next thing you know, maybe in your generation or a few generations that follow, we hit some sort of tyrannical state. So tyranny being an issue of what we're talking about there. The second thing, of course, goes back to an old quote. It goes something like this. God created man. Sam Colt made them all equal. Let's face it, while there may be an inherent spark of the divine in all of us, there's something to recognize there in the intrinsic value of another human being. That doesn't mean that a 5-foot-tall, 90-pound woman who's 90 years old is going to be able to physically resist someone who's 6'5", 250 pounds of sheer muscle and is 25 years old. That's not a very fair fight. And likewise, taking out a less of the extreme, 5-on-1 of a physical force encounter, maybe that one will win. Maybe they're the Chuck Norris or whoever. But I'm betting on that 5, and I'll win a lot of money if I keep doing that every time, right? You get the idea here. And that's before we start talking about improvised weapons and so forth. So what Dr. Peterson is talking about, going back to the quote, I think the right to bear arms is one of the markers of a free society. Because if a government does not trust people, then you start to see that as withdrawing and monopolizing that use of force. So that's the reason why, and I've called it that way before, even before I knew I'd seen this comment. I've said that in videos over the years, that you can, one of the indices for the freedom of society, aside from speech, is also the accessibility to arms. And then he goes on to say, I don't think it's reasonable that only the police and the army should be allowed to be dangerous. Right. Because if citizens are not allowed to be dangerous, that means that we have to rely on the government outsourced to all of our protection against criminals, and we're just gambling that they'll never turn tyrannical. I realize this is a completely different video than what you are used to seeing from this channel, but I find Dr. Peterson to be immensely interesting, immensely worthwhile as a teacher and someone to observe and to learn from, and consequently, as a Second Amendment guy, I've always been curious what his views on weapons are. So I took some time to assemble this video. Hopefully some of you are getting interested in it. Some of you might be interested in Dr. Peterson anyways. Maybe this will trigger an interest, which I strongly suggest that you check him out. But at any rate, if there's other folks you find interesting that you want me to look into more, get some quotes on, that kind of stuff, let me know in the comment field below. Which one was interesting and what do you think his views would be and how do you think he would go about those views? Look forward to joining that discussion after this video is up. Don't forget to hit that like button. Back to the video. Let's go ahead and check out the next quote.
You don't get to have a Sherman tank. Probably you shouldn't have an atom bomb, something like that.
Yeah.
But zero amount of dangerousness is the wrong amount of dangerousness for the autonomous citizen.
All right, so here he says, in response to basically what sort of weapons should be accessible to people, he says, no Sherman tank, no atom bomb. And then he goes on to say, zero amount of dangerousness is the wrong amount of dangerousness for the autonomous citizen. So this links back into the discussion that we just had before in our first clip, namely that there should be some level of dangerousness. There should be some level of potential and power to push back against tyranny. Without that potential and power, you have invited tyranny in. You've opened the door. That doesn't mean that they will come in immediately or even tomorrow or the next generation. But the fact is that you've left the door open and there's no watchman there. That's what I think is the principle of what Dr. Peterson's alluding to there. Let's go back to the first thing he said. He said, no Sherman tank, no atom bomb. I don't mean to speculate or put words in Dr. Peterson's mouth, but seemingly what he's talking about here, and if I had to guess as someone who, again, I can't tell you how many hundreds of hours of Dr. Peterson content I have consumed going back any number of years at this point. What I think he's alluding to is two things. One is the dangerousness of sick, twisted, evil individuals who may seek to do outsized harm to society and their neighbor. If we're giving someone the atom bomb, it's only a matter of time until someone acts up and does something absolutely evil. And instead of that absolutely evil thing being shooting up a school, shooting up a Walmart, shooting up a whatever, we've just given that person outsized power. Now, again, I'm trying to interpret and read into these words what I think he means. Maybe that's wrong, but I'm guessing it's something like that. Because he buttressed and followed that statement with zero amount of dangerousness is the wrong amount of dangerousness. So he's looking at a force or a dangerousness continuum. And he's saying zero isn't the right answer. There are some upper threshold limits, namely tanks and atom bombs. And look, I don't get the sense he's put a tremendous amount of thought into the particular upper limits. I'm guessing he has some ideas, but I don't think it's something that keeps him awake at night thinking about all these sorts of things. I'd love to chat with him about it to understand what are some of those computations implicit in making that thought process for trying to determine what the right level is. How do you balance the criminality issues, the tyranny issues, just taking the Second Amendment out of it and just taking a tabula rasa of, hey, we've set up this island, there's people here, how would you look at this? And take it from there. This next one comes from a Time magazine interview where I'm somewhat unclear, but it looks like he was given a bunch of written questions and he gave back written responses. That could be wrong. And again, I linked this in the description box below, but I think that's what's going on here. Question: would gun legislation help stop school shootings? Here's what Dr. Peterson wrote. I think that in the United States, the probability that gun legislation would stop the school shootings is basically zero. School shooting culture doesn't seem to have manifested itself in other places as much as it has in the US, and I can't tell exactly why that is. It's conceivable that it has something to do with the more rough and ready attitude towards guns. So basically a bit of a non-answer, but really what he's done is he's left open a bunch of different doors there while establishing the fact that the probability that gun legislation would stop school shootings is basically zero. We have tried forever as a species to legislate our way out of acts of evil. In case you were unaware, murder is already illegal. Passing more laws is not going to bring evil down to zero. Now, you can have a discussion about, well, will more gun control laws maybe not bring things down to zero, but will it bring things down? Of course, a counter discussion is, even if it does bring things down, we know that according to the 2013 CDC study ordered by then President Barack Obama, there's somewhere between about 500,000 to 2.5 million or more self-defense firearm uses in the United States every single year. So while you might be protecting innocents in one arena, conceivably, because there's somewhere between 10 to 20,000 uses of firearms and homicides in the United States every year, how many other victims, how many other innocents are we dooming to die because we have stripped their ability to protect themselves? Again, that's part of the discussion if we are accepting and adopting a utilitarian analysis of, well, we've got numbers over here, how do we get the lowest numbers? That's a utilitarian analysis. I'm not suggesting that that is in any way, shape, or form the only or the most appropriate framework to use. I'm just suggesting that that's one that's very easy to fall into and one that our culture tends to tilt towards in a lot of respects. And then he leaves open the door for further discussion. This last one was in response to the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel. And no, this is 0% to get into politics about any of that kind of stuff. I'm only citing this because this was the only other time on record where Dr. Peterson spoke about these sorts of issues. In response, Dr. Peterson said this, quote, "Our defense systems are way more porous than anyone would ever want to think. It's very, very difficult to stop people who are willing to light themselves on fire just to singe you. Any random person in a civilized society can cause an unbelievable amount of mayhem and trouble, and in order to forestall that possibility completely, which would be impossible anyway, we would have to move towards a surveillance state like China where we are monitored 100% of the time. And then the cure would be worse than the disease. I don't think defenses cannot be porous in a society that is still vaguely free. And even if you lock people down, people can still cause a lot of trouble if they're hellbent on doing it," end quote. So again, Dr. Peterson is accessing that scale of how dangerous should people be, understanding that there's a shadow scale to it. The less dangerous people are allowed to be, that means the more power has been monopolized by the state. And in order to push people down to the point where people are all helpless, aside from whatever long list of problems that would create, one of them, if it's not number one, it's got to be number 2 or 3, is the simple amount of intrusion and tyranny and East German surveillance state we would have to turn into in order to try to push to the point where those numbers are going to be 0. And at that point, are we really better off? That's a fair question. And I think that's what, again, he's putting his finger on those scales to reference that. So I hope that you enjoyed this tour of Dr. Peterson's thoughts involving firearms, weapons, and the Second Amendment here in the United States. Obviously, Dr. Peterson is a Canadian. No one's perfect. That's okay. If you have other examples of Dr. Peterson being on record, let me know in the comment field below. I appreciate this video is a little out of left field. If there's other videos of other folks or thinkers that you want to see where I try to go through and catalog their views on weapons and the Second Amendment, let me know in the comment field below. Otherwise, we close with our ever popular quote of the day. Quote, "Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient." Jordan Peterson. Thanks for sticking around. I will see you in the comment section below and in the next video. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.